so again, the goal of this presentation is to gain greater clarity on pressing privacy issues as they're related to the pandemic. The advocacy goal, why do we care? Why are we doing this work? It's not just to broadcast it for the sake of broadcasting. It's broadcasting so we can make our knowledge actionable. And so in a larger context, the goal here is to stop big tech from using the pandemic as a power grab for their own interests, but that would set a negative precedent for individual liberties, especially the right to privacy. And the goal is to not only mobilize you participants into taking action, but for you all to help educate in your own communities. This is a very convoluted topic, and there's a lot of education work that needs to be done. And so the flow a little bit, we will go through a good chunk of foundations. So where does the right to privacy come from and what does that look like? And then we'll go into COVID concerns. How is it manifesting? How are these privacy rights manifesting during the pandemic? And the three kind of buckets we're looking at here is criminal, legal, and surveillance, contact tracing, using technology to assist with that, and then finally classroom tech, so ed tech kind of stuff. We'll review recommendations and remedies and then ways to get involved. So with that, let's dive right in. Jess, if you want to kick us off with foundations.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much for that. So yeah, let's go a little bit in terms of where does our right to privacy come from? So there's this quote by Chief Justice John Roberts in a recent Supreme Court case that goes, "The fact that technology now allows an individual to carry such information in his hands does not make the information any less worthy of the protection for which the founders fought." And pretty much this quote sort of encompasses how we think of privacy rights in the United States. So although the Constitution does not explicitly state the right of privacy, we still see the document safeguarding right along with personal autonomy and through how we write our federal laws and how the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution over the years. So for example, federal laws are written to protect individuals' personal information, such as the Fair Credit Reporting Act. This is kind of one of the first federal privacy laws that provides data protection for a person's financial information collected by credit agencies, and it puts limits on who can access that information. We have later on the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and this was a federal law that protects the privacy of your digital life by protecting information like your email, your cell phone, and location records, Facebook posts, cloud computing documents. The ACLU kind of considers this fairly an outdated law because there's still ways and loopholes that governments can intercept and access information about like who you are, where you go, what you do on your cell phone, you know, in terms of getting information from your cell phone provider, social networking sites, and so forth. And then, of course, everyone probably may know the Health Information Portability Accountability Act, HIPAA. And basically, this is to ensure that individuals' information about their health is properly set in disclosure standards and making sure that we keep our health information protected and safe. So if we were to look at some of the landmark cases argued before the Supreme Court, many of the issues here will hinge also on privacy. Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965 was about marital privacy to determine a married couple's right to determine their own family planning and access to contraception. And that in this case, it explained that privacy was found to be basically what was called penumbras or shadows or extensions of the rights that we see explicitly stated in the Constitution, such as the right to not self-incriminate yourself. Of course, we have Roe v. Wade, which was the right to abortion, and that the due process clause in the 14th Amendment also provides a kind of fundamental right of privacy that protects a woman's choice to whether or not wanted to have an abortion, or an individual's choice to have an abortion, of course, in balance with the government's compelling state interests, which we'll discuss a little bit more on a different slide. There's Lawrence versus Texas, where the 14th Amendment was used again to imply that the privacy of adults to engage in consensual intimacy with same-sex partners. And then if we begin to start looking at court cases that begin to start talking directly about digital privacy, you have Carpenter versus United States, which was decided a couple of years ago. And this basically was a decision that came 5-4, where the court ruled that government needs a warrant to access a person's cell phone location history, and that obtaining that kind of information was considered a search under the Fourth Amendment, and therefore you would need a warrant from a judge based on probable cause. And so really beginning to go into the territory where we're now seeing cases that are directly addressing digital data and our privacy to have that protected. But of course, with all constitutional rights, even the right to privacy is not absolute. So there are state and federal laws, of course, that can limit an individual's privacy right when there is a compelling government interest to do so. And factors on this will probably depend on the place or the activity of the location. So for example, the expectation of privacy in the home. This is likely to be the clearest example of a place where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. The privacy doesn't just extend to homeowners, but tenants as well. And certainly we know that the invasion of privacy doesn't just mean when someone bursts through your home, entering your place looking for things, but it also extends, when you expect privacy to your electronic equipment, or when you want privacy when it comes to government entities using electronics to monitor or record what someone is doing in their home. This would extend to there. You certainly have the expectation of privacy in schools. Certainly at the ACLU, we teach students that they don't shed their constitutional rights to freedom of expression at the schoolhouse gate. But that's also so long as their expression doesn't create what's called a substantial disruption to the learning environment of a school. Well, why do we say that? Well, that's because we also understand that the government, in the case school districts here, are also tasked with the responsibility of educating minors, and they too have a compelling interest to ensure a safe learning environment for all of their students. And then you can also see expectation of privacy in public. Although this wouldn't rise to the same level as having a privacy in your home or school. Some folks can still have a reasonable expectation of privacy even in public, as long as the public doesn't necessarily have a legitimate interest in such information. So for example, if you were to get into a car accident on a public road, well, that's for everyone to see. It's on a public road. There may not be necessarily a full expectation of privacy, but that may change if, say, you have to go into an ambulance and talk with a first responder that's, medically health related. Then even though it may feel like it's on a public road, the expectation of privacy may change a little bit. And Jen is going to talk and continue to go into our foundations about what's happening now.
Thanks, Jess. So what's happening now? Technology. So here's actually we'll start with some background definitions, right? So what we know is that in public opinion surveys, the vast majority of people across party lines, political identifications, are in support not only of privacy rights in general, but specifically in support of consumer data privacy. Like they want their data to be protected. Excuse me. But interestingly, the other part of that is roughly 50% or more don't understand data collection or the mechanics of how it works. I think I'm still kind of in that camp, even though I've done lots of research and follow the issue. My point is that you do not need to be a technologist meaning someone who works directly in tech, creating or analyzing data, creating apps, what have you, or policies. You do not need to fall into that camp to be someone who advocates for the right to privacy, who sticks up for your privacy rights, or is interested and involved in this issue. If we think about voting rights, You don't have to be in the Secretary of State's office or a political campaign operative to be involved with the fight for voter access or encouraging people to exercise that right. You can be an everyday person, and you should be. We need a broad coalition. So to do some level setting here, let's briefly run through some definitions that will pop up, especially when we talk about privacy today. So consumer data privacy, what we mean by that is the handling and protection of the sensitive personal information provided by customers and consumers during everyday transactions. So with the dawn of the internet, data has taken a new value for corporations. And as a result, any interaction that we have with businesses or online entities, no matter how passive we think they are, result in the collection of consumer data. And this is because this data has become really valuable. The harvesting of data and the analysis and then operating on that has led to improved online tracking, behavioral profiling, and data-driven marketing. Again, so this data is very profitable. That's the incentive. It's quite simple. When we say big tech, it's a term used to describe the 4 or 5 major technology companies being Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. Microsoft is sometimes left off the list. We keep it on as ACLU. Okay, when we say big data, what do we mean? I also think of big data as artificial intelligence food, and we'll see why. So extremely large sets of data sets that big data is extremely large data sets that may be analyzed computationally to reveal patterns, trends, and associations, especially relating to human behavior and interactions. So basically, machine learning and artificial intelligence mechanisms are literally fed massive amounts of data, because the more data they're fed, the more effective they are. On top of that, the economic environment for this is that this is already a multi-billion-dollar industry of big data, of the selling of folks' data. But in the next 5 years, it's supposed to increase by $100 billion. So that's why there's so many people trying to sell it. And we call those folks third-party data brokers. So they work very covertly. They work with apps and other technology companies to make sure that the most amount of consumer data possible is harvested through the use of the app, but also that that harvesting is as opaque and secretive as possible, because you don't want to deter the user. That's literally the intention, right? And so while these people hold a ton of data on people in the US, they're very fragmented and very opaque and secretive, so it's not a centralized location. And next slide, please, Jess. Thank you so much. And so this is kind of the short of it, is that technological, in terms of what's going on in regulatory wise in the US, technological growth outpaces the laws and legal rulings by a lot. Technology grows like this exponentially, and the pace of Congress and the courts is the snail's pace, right? So that's not inherently an issue. But we also already talked about big tech, and those are very, very powerful tech companies that have giant and endless deep pockets, and therefore deep lobbying arms. So it's harder to pass things in the US. However, like we already mentioned, there's a huge appetite for consumer data privacy. And so despite all of this imbalance of power at Congress, there's still progress that's being made. We see that in the EU, who has the GDPR, which is the most stringent in the world. It requires that if an app wants to sell your information to a third-party data broker, they have to alert you of that in explicit, plain language, and then get your affirmative consent to do so. There's also huge, steep penalties for companies that do not comply, because you can imagine if you don't have the teeth in that bill, these deep-pocketed big tech companies will just include smaller fines as operating costs. Again, in the US, we've been having a much harder time passing anything that's federal or countrywide. So you see lots of states trying to take it up on their own. So we have a patchwork of data privacy laws that's confusing for technologists and users and governments. But either way, California passed their law it's implemented this year. It's the strongest one in the country, but it's not nearly as strong as the one in the EU. And in these contingency plans, when it comes to, all of the congressional discussions on how to respond to COVID, big data has been explicitly mentioned, and so is consumer privacy. We've seen a draft of something called the COVID-19 Consumer Data Protection Act. And then there was a hearing in Congress that brought together industry folks and advocates to kind of talk about the role of big data. And the consensus there was that all data must be anonymized. If big data is involved in the abatement of COVID-19, that all the data must be anonymized and deleted afterward. So yeah. Next slide, Jess, or I think I'm done. Oh, it's me. So we're gonna go really brief here on who is involved in this privacy rights issue, who's for and who's against. This is not at all meant to be a definitive list. It is really just the intention here is a snapshot of it's kind of a smorgasbord of people who are generally for and against, or as I'm stealing from Jess Strange Bedfellows here, for example, you might typically think of the people rallying for increased privacy protections as your tinfoil hatters or your crunchy granola, I don't use Wi-Fi folks. But really, it's more than just those people. You have POC-led groups and scholars and tech workers. And on the other side, we have government and big tech who are often, or big government and big tech who are often lockstep in their hunger for big data. And that is because big tech can sell big data to government who can use it in defense contracting or other spy type operations.
So now that we've kind of given an overview of the foundations, thanks Jen for leading us in, we have the foundations of kind of where our privacy is coming from, our right to privacy is coming from, and kind of the lay of the land. We want to address kind of some of the concerns that we are seeing in the age of this pandemic. So when we're looking at the issue of privacy and surveillance and how law enforcement is interacting, since the pandemic, ACLU affiliates across the country have been monitoring how law enforcement agencies are using their resources to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. As mentioned before, it comes to no surprise that police departments fall on the side of more surveillance of its citizens. So for example, our colleagues in Massachusetts raised concerns when its state ordered every local health department to collect the address information of COVID-19 positive individuals, and then asked to share that status on its computer dispatch systems with first responders, so police and ambulance. The ACLU of Massachusetts ended up writing a letter asking for the state's Department of Public Health for more specifics on how they plan on implementing this policy. Certainly concerns that are being raised as it relates to departments or law enforcement asking to receive some kind of a heads up before they go to an address of COVID-19 positive folks is that certainly it raises many HIPAA privacy concerns as to the privacy of a person's health information, and that it could also chill individuals who may be seeking help and treats the diagnosis as a stigmatized status instead. Certainly, we can agree that protecting the health of our first responders is a highly, important priority. But experts are kind of indicating that sharing this kind of private information really isn't sound from a health perspective, because one, so few people are being tested, and a number of individuals are asymptomatic. So even if you may go to a home that doesn't have the COVID-19 designation, that doesn't mean necessarily that the folks inside don't have it anyway. And so instead, I think, the best approach is to ensure that our first responders are always taking precautions and they have the proper PPE or protective equipment when entering a home. When it comes to the issues of seeing law enforcement expanding surveillance programs in the name of public health, we're definitely seeing, in Baltimore in early April, in the midst of all of this in the pandemic, that officials approved a contract between the Baltimore Police Department and a company called Persistent Surveillance Systems. And basically, they approved a contract to use drones equipped with high resolution cameras to surveil and fly around to watch city residents around the clock, even though that there were objections from civil rights liberties watchdogs like the ACLU and the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. Well, now the ACLU is filed a lawsuit against the Baltimore police seeking an injunction or basically asking them to stop the program. Certainly, what we know a bit about aerial surveillance programs is that while it definitely impacts the privacy of everyone, unfortunately, due to the department's history with racial discrimination, communities of color will likely be disproportionately targeted from the program. And then, of course, we're monitoring issues that are occurring in our own backyard. The Denver Department of Safety has been quietly expanding its surveillance program during this crisis, creating a real-time crime information center program. And essentially what that does is that it has a police technician in a room reviewing hundreds of cameras throughout the city and then relays in real-time information, accidents or the activities of citizens to law enforcement that are on the ground. So what's troubling a bit about this program is that it expands the current HALO camera network that the police already have, which stands for High Activity Location. But the thing is that not only are they using the cameras that have been installed by the police department, they're also tapping in to the cameras that belong to the Denver Public School District, RTD, and CDOT cameras as well. So certainly the ACLU has been raising concerns as to whether the Department of Safety did their due diligence to involve community input before they expanded this program, and also concerns about whether the areas that are being most monitored is primarily focused on Black and Brown communities. So again, we're monitoring this situation as it progresses. But here at the ACLU of Colorado, we definitely have a track history of raising similar concerns about law enforcement agencies' use of surveillance tracking programs on its citizens. So for example, back in 2003, the ACLU settled a lawsuit against the Denver Police Department for its Spy Files program. And basically that uncovered the department's practice of monitoring and recording peaceful protesters, law-abiding activists in the metro area, but they were being categorized as criminal extremists. Mark Silverstein, who is our ACLU legal director, worked with the Denver police to create policies that better protect citizens' privacy by helping to make sure that changes with the department made sure that they weren't collecting information about how people were exercising their First Amendment rights unless they thought that it was relevant to a criminal activity. But of course, when you have changes in city leadership over the years, these measures can be forgotten. So then as recently as 2016, our affiliate raised these same concerns with the Denver Department of Safety when it wanted to implement a Geophidia program, which basically is a social media surveillance software that was meant to, again, monitor the free speech activities of individuals and groups who were not suspected of any criminal activity, and found that this software program was being used at MLK parades and 420 rallies. And Jen will then talk about another issue that is coming up when it relates to our privacy.
Awesome, thanks, Jess. Okay, so something that folks have probably heard about in the news is technology-assisted contact tracing. That might not be exactly how you're hearing it about it in the news, but what you might be hearing is using location and apps as a form of contact tracing. Now, there's a lot to this issue. There's a lot of different proposals on how this would work, and there's tons of factors to consider. But before we dive into all of that, let's ground ourselves in remembering like what actually is contact tracing before we go run away into the tech world. And so contact tracing is a tried and true public health measure. And it's, besides the definition that you all can read on the screen, it's really about working with public officials, being able to map and anticipate the spread of a virus through working with individuals. We also, or might be more familiar to folks when working with STDs and STIs. You know, okay, try and recall who are your past sexual partners, call them, tell them to get tested. It's really, really effective. But like all effective public health measures, it's only effective when we are leveraging people's own incentive to report and stop the spread. So, for example, people want to stay healthy themselves and for their households, and they want to help their community. So leaning into that and not leaning into using public shaming or punishment, because that will deter people. This thing will come up over and over again. And again, it's important to remember when we're talking about this, that it's technology-assisted contact tracing should be there to enhance contact tracing, to further it, not to replace it with apps only. And so next slide, please, Jess, thank you. So before we dive in, we're going to look at 3 proposals that are common in terms of what technology-assisted contact tracing can look like. But before that, we'll touch on some major concepts, just because I'll be floating around words and we kind of want to be on the same page. So when we're looking at proposals, we want to make sure that they balance effectiveness, necessity, and intrusion. So we as ACLU recognize that we're in extraordinary times and that privacy is always a balancing act, like so many of our rights. And so because of the extraordinary times, there might be different balances to consider. And we also understand that the virus poses a grave risk. So we shouldn't just write off tools that could have the potential to mitigate the problem. And we're not saying that there's no technology that can assist in contact tracing. There are ways to do it, but preserving privacy is not only a necessity because we're obliged to, because it's one of our rights, but also for functionality. We have a distinct culture in the US and lots of healthy distrust of the government. So we really, really have to be delicate when we're unrolling these type of technologies and apps. And also it's noteworthy that in the US, our major problem is the fact that we're still lacking testing and equipment. A lot of these technology-assisted programs are successful in places that actually have the ability for people to get tested and have the equipment for people to stay safe, or have the ability for people to quarantine and still be able to make their basic needs met, right? And so that's also part of the reason that we're not hearing, or that could be part of the reason why we're not hearing from public health officials a huge cry that we need an app to handle this. What the call is still for testing equipment and actual human contact tracers. And so you'll hear centralized, and so some concepts, again, to touch on before diving in, is anonymization. So anonymization is when you take data and you remove all the personal identifiable information. So you can still meet the goal of what you're trying to figure out, but you can't trace back individual data points to a unique person. When we're talking about centralized versus decentralized, in some countries there is a centralized place where all data is generally stored or funneled to. And in the US, we do not have that. There's voluntary versus coercive. So voluntary looks like, hey, you can download this app and participate if you want to help in your community. This is how the app works. This is how your data is used. Versus coercive. You need to download and participate in this app if you want to return to work or to society. There's also punitive versus collaborative. So punitive is, okay, we're using these technologies to identify areas that are troubled, so we're going to police that area. Versus a collaborative approach would say, hey, you can opt into this, and you can choose if you want to, if you get infected, you can choose to upload your location data in a protective manner. Other people can choose to look at your posting to see if you've crossed paths. And that'll make more sense as we comb through those 3 examples. But regardless, for any proposal to do with this issue, the guiding questions that will help are, what is the goal of this proposal? What data is being collected? Who gets that data? So who's going to store and manage it? How is that data being used? Again, is it being used to coerce people, or to using positive social influence to get people to get involved? And then what's the life cycle of that data? Is it going to be deleted? And if so, what are the markers for that? And that's what we use at the ACLU to analyze proposals. But I also recommend that that folks use these questions as kind of like when you're consuming media, or when you're hearing about different proposals yourself. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we get into these proposals, we're reviewing broadly 3 major ones, just again to help illustrate the issue. But before doing that, it's again noteworthy to talk about our unique atmosphere in the US. So for one, we don't have federal laws to anchor our privacy concerns or to anchor any of these proposals, unlike in the EU. And we also don't have a data ecosystem that is that would make it possible for a lot of these proposals. For again, we've mentioned, is there a centralized data body in the US? No. Instead, what we have are those opaque data brokers that are A, not trustworthy, and B, opaque. Unlike in a country like China, who's a centralized body of data. Okay, so then we also want to recognize US culture. So it's noteworthy that the best successes with app-based contact tracing have mostly come from countries in which compliance can be forced to a greater degree than would be possible or politically conceivable in the US. And it's really important to remember. And so with that, I will actually start talking about these proposals without trying to be wonky. Okay, so mass tracking. Location, so what this does is, so it takes the location of a newly discovered coronavirus positive person and matches it against everyone else's location records. And then anyone who's been near said infected person would be notified, would be told to get testing and or to quarantine. And so those type of data movements and locations are collected through various technologies such as cell towers, GPS, and combining Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. And so one of the major problems here is inaccuracy of data. Because remember, we want to inform people who were in close proximity or close enough proximity to actually be at risk for transmission, which again, it's like that 6 feet. And false positives will have disastrous consequences, especially in the US. So we can imagine many scenarios. Another issue with that is that those using cell towers and GPS and combinations of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are really unreliable and not specific enough. They cast wider ranges. So an example is maybe we're in the same apartment building, but it's a huge apartment complex. We probably necessarily didn't really come in close enough contact for transmission. There's also nuances like, in Israel, where this is being used, a woman went to wave to her partner who was sick and in quarantine, and she immediately got an alert saying that she needed to go get testing and to quarantine because she was too close to him. Some people say, well, better safe than sorry. But if we're telling people to quarantine or go get tested in our country where there's such limited supplies and testing, that's actually being counterproductive. Plus, we can imagine a scenario in which first responders and essential workers are being falsely told to quarantine or test, and then we lose some of those essential workers. And so this is also interesting because you have to consider who's going to be the enforcer, or what's the enforcement mechanism. If there was an error and there's a false positive sent, and you're in a place where the government will force you into a quarantine, that's obviously very problematic. Or you could be punished for breaking a quarantine when really you weren't in close proximity to anyone. That's obviously an issue. And so, like so many ambitious plans for automated recording and analysis of human life that are everywhere these days in kind of a tech utopia, but in reality, they've been unreliable because human life is messy, complicated, and full of anomalies. Okay, so another proposal is to use location-specific data to help identify recent whereabouts of an infected person, and then alert alert strangers that they may have been in contact with that person. So we primarily see that example in South Korea. So South Korea in order to make this work, passed legislation that allows the government to collect location data of infected people. So if you test positive, then boom, the government gets to map out all of your location data. But what officials then anonymize that data and post it on a website, so for people to see. So people can, and they have multiple apps and websites, so people can go on that website and check for themselves. Hey, I was, by this grocery store, I went through this park, or I rode this train, and oh, this person has been infected, so maybe I should take precautions. However, there has been poor anonymization happening in North Korea. This is an example. An alert said a 43-year-old man, resident of the Nowon district, and is infected, and he's been at the place of work, at his place of work in Mapao district, attending a sexual harassment class. So that's obviously a glaring privacy violation, at least by US standards. And just that incident alone created a chilling effect in terms of people not wanting to participate because they were more afraid of social humiliation than of the disease itself. And obviously we can imagine that wouldn't work out well in the US. And it's also noteworthy that it's surprisingly hard to anonymize data, but it's especially hard when it comes to location data because people reveal themselves by where they go. So for example, a study finds that simply combining zip code, where someone works, and where someone lives will uniquely identify 5% of the population. If you replace zip codes with census tracts, which are smaller, about a city block, that number jumps to 50%. And so you could also imagine a scenario in which, an alert was put out and it was supposedly anonymized as possible, but there might be 4 people who live in zip code A and also live in zip code B. An alert goes out, and 3 of those people aren't infected, but they could be treated really poorly because they fit the supposedly anonymized profile that has been posted. And as this is especially would be a problem in the US, because we already are seeing a lot of tension between different social groups. We're seeing a lot of racism towards Asian people for being accused of bringing the virus here. And so we can imagine that if people had that type of information, but they don't have access to testing, and there's already a lot of distrust between groups, that there could be a pretty bad problem there. If you want to go to the next one, Jess. Thank you. Okay, so this one will be more brief on the aggregate location data to identify travel trends. So this is taking a lot of location data and then making it aggregate. So really generalizing it, looking at movement in a broader view. And this is primarily to identify travel trends, who's coming from adjacent communities or towns, and what can epidemiologists learn from that in terms of trend and threat, and how can they mitigate. However, the problem with this in the US is that there still needs to be a party to hold the data, the raw data with the personally identifiable information before it is aggregated. And in the US, who would be the trusted party to do that? We don't have one, again, because of that ecosystem. There's also a huge risk, especially when we're looking at neighborhoods, of having biased data. And Jess already touched on it, but we could have even more bias in data when it comes to policing and surveillance, which again works against our public health goals very much so, and does greater harm to communities who are already struggling the most. And again, this kind of contact tracing is worth one more time to note. Enforcement is really important to look at when we're looking at aggregate data. Public health officials, especially, besides, we're not, ACLU is not the only one, public health officials especially stress that if law enforcement involved in trying to achieve these public health goals, then it'll work against our goal to reduce infection. And Jess, I will pass it over to you to talk about our next bucket of COVID-related issues.
Yes, thank you, Jen, so much. So one of the other areas of concern when it comes to data privacy in the COVID-19 crisis is what is happening with our remote learning. There's a Washington Post article where there's a quote that data is the new oil. And certainly you see that in the way in which companies are approaching the data of students. So as schools are rapidly moving online across the country, there's concerns about whether for-profit companies are good stewards of data privacy, student data and their privacy. So unfortunately, ed tech, which is this classified term or an umbrella term for tech companies that specialize in digital educational products, has a proven track record for mining students' data in ways that maximize company products or company profits, excuse me. So in 2018, the FBI issued a warning to the public about concerns that education technologies that were collecting widespread data on K through 12 students could have serious privacy and safety implications if it became compromised or exploited through cyber attacks. So types of data that we're looking at that could potentially be up for grabs in these attacks or vulnerable include personal identifiable information, a student's academic progress, any behavioral, disciplinary, or medical information, web browsing history, and IP addresses. Certainly, I will say that, I'm currently homeschooling a kid right now during this pandemic. I can't tell you how many apps we have to use on a daily basis to support his learning. Certainly one of the first questions that I asked his teacher was just how much information were they providing to these companies just to set up his account, because there is great concern that as my son continues using some of these programs, information that's being gathered on how he learns, any troubles that he may be having with any particular subjects, could be very much recorded and analyzed for the future. Perhaps some folks will remember 6 years ago how the nonprofit company In Bloom was selling massive amounts of student data to other companies. Even though it's shut down, there are plenty of other companies that have taken its place. And because policies, laws, and regulations have yet to catch up with the technological advances that some of these companies are using, it's really hard to imagine that we are going to be able to go back to a time where ed tech companies don't have such a strong hold over students' data. So some platforms certainly that are kind of coming up or bubbling up through the pandemic that we have questions about is the Canvas Learning Management System, or LMS. And this is one that operates across the country in thousands of colleges, universities, and K through 12 schools. They already have access to data from millions of faculty and students. And they're actually, in some reports are kind of quite giddy about the amount of student data that they have and the possibilities being endless and how they can develop algorithms and predictive models from this data. Certainly, we just have to call it out. Zoom, the very tool that we're using now to do this webinar, the application has quickly established itself as the education solution for remote learning and meetings. And if you look in kind of like the Apple Store in March, it held the position for the top downloaded app in the store, offering basically its free services just to gain a market share. Even Facebook's Oculus VR system, this is also making its way as an educational tool that is collecting data on a wide range of points concerning a user's emotional and physiological experiences within the virtual spaces. They're collecting all of that data, and that data then can also potentially then be sold to advertisers or for folks who are interested in human capital performance markets. So, based off of how they may react in certain games, think that they may be, a good consumer for other products or gym equipment, things like that. So certainly concerns about discriminatory consequences of data exploitation does arise when data collected about an individual at a point can potentially lead to closed opportunities later on, such as whether data information about a student's disability or tracking a student's behavior could potentially be used to exacerbate the already growing issue of the school to prison pipeline. There's also concern that the impact of data could have on undocumented students and their families who may be sensitive to disclosing their personal identifying information if they think that could expose them to ICE enforcement and chill their ability to participate in remote learning along with their peers. And certainly when it comes to data collection of students, this also overflows in the use of the higher education. Online proctor services like Procterio, ProctorU, they're basically services that ensure the integrity of administering tests by professors and are getting increased access to students' cameras and microphones. Usually there may be a live proctor on the other side of the screen, but basically they watch students' faces, they can listen to them talk, request that they aim their camera around the room to prove that they're not cheating on an exam. Some companies even use facial recognition technology, eye tracking, in order to, again, detect like how computer screens are being used when students are taking the test. And certainly with physical distancing impacting workspaces, some of these same companies are also having their proctors work from home to oversee tests. And certainly that's raising further privacy concerns about whether the company is adequately overseeing individuals who have access to students' video streams and therefore their homes. So now that we've kind of given you some of the concerns that have cropped up through this crisis, we could talk a little bit more about what we think some of those ACLU recommendations and remedies are.
Just sealed the deal for me. I will not have kids and I will not go back to school because that is way too creepy. Okay, so when it comes to technology-assisted contact tracing, as you can see in this tiny print, we have lots of principles or guiding points in terms of what would be an appropriate technology. And so I bolded the really important ones, which again we've mentioned. I'll let that siren pass. That is the soundtrack of advocacy from home. Okay, so again, it's voluntary. That is very important. Non-punitive, built with public health professionals. This is worth highlighting because we don't just want techies and technologists to design something. This really needs to be designed in deference to public health professionals, their knowledge, best practice, and their goals. The rest are kind of self-explanatory, privacy preserving, of course, non-discriminatory, minimization of data, but also measurable impact. So do these apps actually work? And if we're found that they're not work, how do we close them down? And part of that is to be very clear on the goal in the beginning when the app is launched, and have regular reporting that looks at benchmarks to make sure it's still being effective. It's also important that this is narrowly tailored to target a specific epidemic. Again, not trying to use like, oh, well, why don't we just keep this app around to track the flu or this and that? We can see how that's privacy creep and how that can lead down a dangerous roads in terms of privacy rights and discrimination. It's also important that this data is deleted, that there's a point at which this data is no longer held. We can imagine a scenario in which there's an app that is otherwise pretty up to our standards, but they say, hey, you have to take a selfie on this app, but then they don't delete any of that data. We remember that AI and machine learning live off of data. So those face pictures are actually really valuable if people got to keep that, if the app got to keep that, and then they sold that to a third-party data broker, right? And so again, this is a balancing act, which is why I've put a palatable proposal. It is not entirely perfect, but it's far better than a lot of the proposals we've been seeing. And one of those is decentralized Bluetooth base. So Bluetooth is better at proximity because it is a shorter range. So if you're in someone's Bluetooth range, it's more likely that you're actually in the proximity to transmit the infection. It's also, Bluetooth is a radio wave, so it doesn't give that much or it doesn't give personally identifiable information, and it doesn't excuse me, and it doesn't give geolocation. So basically, it's like your phone would be assigned a random number if you choose to opt into this, and every few hours it would report kind of a timestamp. And then so would your neighbors or whoever else is participating in that. Let's say you get sick, you can volunteer to say that in the app, and it would post and you could go on there as another user and see that, oh, my number crossed with that person's number, I should take precautions. But again, you just see that you had a number crossing, you don't see that where that person has been or who that person specifically is. Jess will talk to us about the dystopia of schooling these days.
Yes, so as definitely we mentioned before, the ACLU is concerned about the increasing reliance on third-party ed tech applications, because we know that these laws and regulations just has not been keeping up with the growing technology in order to oversee some of these platforms. So now that, however, some suggestions that we're raising at the ACLU, colleagues at the national level would like to kind of look at is that if these companies are offering, the free remote learning platforms as a public good, then some of the things that we would like to see is that, one, that the use of these free remote learning platforms, which for many families may be the only option to continue contact with teachers and provide their children with an education, should be conditioned or should not be conditioned, on students allowing companies to gather and retain their private and personal information. Further, government entities like school districts should be insisting that these ed tech companies limit their personal information gathering only to what is necessary for the platform's remote learning. Second, ed tech companies should be required to expunge all of the personal information that they gather during this crisis when it resolves, unless a student, specifically opts in to the information being retained, like being like a clear post-crisis request to keep the information, and not part of this, broad user agreement that you have no choice to select because you have to, turn your homework in. Third, we want governments and school districts to insist that ed tech companies disable any of the surveillance functions that accompany their remote learning applications, including communications and social media monitoring, keyword alerts, and web filtering functions. And last, what we would definitely like to see ed techs do is, if they're going to keep their promise, they should consent to governments auditing their compliance with the pandemic subsidies. So, we want to see if, we ask that these companies get rid of the information. We don't want to find out 6 months later, you know, after the pandemic has subside, that they've sold our students' data to somebody else. And so with that, now that we kind of know what those concerns are and kind of some recommendations, you may be asking, well, what does that mean for me? How do I get involved? You know, what are my rights? And so hopefully we can just kind of give you some takeaways in terms of how to protect your privacy. So, of course, we've mentioned that the Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable government searches and seizures, and that this protection expands to your computer and your cell phones and other digital devices. But how does that work? So, what should you do if police or law enforcement officers show up at your door and they want to search your computer or wish to take your device back to the police station? Well, the same principles that we teach in our KYR workshops as it relates to what to do in a police encounter, say you're pulled over in a traffic stop, also apply here as well. So if you are asked questions by law enforcement, such as the password to open your device, you have the right to remain silent. So using phrases like, I'm going to remain silent, or I'm going to remain silent and I would like to see a lawyer, would encompass that. It's also important to reiterate that unless law enforcement has a search warrant or they have probable cause to believe that you're about to commit a crime or that you're in the midst of committing a crime, you do not have to consent to have your device searched. But, you know, that doesn't mean I'm refusing for you to search my phone, but here's the password anyway. Well, you just gave consent to search your phone. So making sure that you're being very clear that you're not consenting to the search. And this is really important because if a police were to violate your rights and conduct an illegal search, then often, hopefully, this evidence that they do obtain from the result of the search can't be used against you in court. If you're at home and police are knocking on your door, you don't have to let them in unless they have in their possession a search warrant. The safest thing to do, of course, is to step outside, close the door behind you. They may indicate right away why they're there, but if they have a warrant, ask to see it. Make sure that warrant contains one, correct name of the person being arrested or the correct address of the specific place being searched, a list of the items that they can seize, a list, a judge's signature, of course, and then a deadline as to when the search may take place. So just be aware that just as we discussed previously how the expectation of privacy differs from place or activity, note that police can search your computer or portable devices at the border without a warrant because the Fourth Amendment protection isn't as strong at the border than what it is at your home. Again, you have the right to speak with the police and you have the right to consent to search of your belongings, but you also always have the right to remain silent or refuse consent of your devices to be searched. You have to determine in what situation, what's the balance of exercising your rights. But certainly if you do want to learn more about your rights on this matter, particularly when it comes to protecting your data privacy, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has some really excellent resources and even a pocket guide that you can take with you when you're, say, like at the airport. And certainly we can provide this link on our Advocacy at Home webpage under the resource section.
Awesome. So other ways that you can get involved that are a little, that are more in terms of collective action and activism. So we know that there is a lot of, generally, because again, those public opinion surveys, that there's a strong support for the right to privacy, but I apologize for my cat knocking things down. What are you gonna do? Okay, so what we need to do is organize our communities and contingencies that are allowed and say, hey, we do care about our data privacy, and yes, this app is valuable, but that doesn't mean it's that they should have a right to mine so much of my information. yes, this app is valuable to me, but my data is really valuable to this company, so let's find a better balance. So really, we need people to express to us, do you want to get involved? Does this really matter to you? And you can kind of self-select by filling out our activist survey, which is the second bullet point. And or you can contact me directly. I will send a follow-up email with some resources tomorrow. But if you're like, hey, Jen, I'm actually working this field and it's this is where I work in tech, or I have a concern here, or my kid there, like I would love to hear that. And so would Jess, because we really care about that. And we want to figure out who our ACLU supporters are that are really passionate about this issue. It's also important that ACLU supporters are watchdogs in your own local communities. So there might be something going on like that is local only that your law enforcement is doing allegedly like in response to COVID, but they're increasing surveillance. We have a broad reach, but we can't be everywhere. And a lot of the cases or policies come from ACLU supporters alerting us to something in their community. So if you hear of something that's going on with your municipal government or your local law enforcement that seems anti-privacy, let us know. The email is right there. Again, I'll include it in a follow-up email to participants, but it's voting@aclu-co.org. That's generally where we have people report instances of voter suppression, but it's also an appropriate place to report instances of privacy suppression. So we really, and you don't have to be for sure, hey, I've analyzed this policy and it's anti-privacy. Be like, hey, I don't know, this has to do with privacy and we're hearing about it. That's just totally fine and enough. So basically we want to hear from you and your involvement. But with that, I think we can open it up for a couple of questions, unless everyone is just scrambling to craft their own tinfoil hats and they don't want to ask questions. I don't know.
We do have a couple of questions here, and let me go ahead and read one. And I think the first one is for Jess. We were talking about the right to privacy and, the right to search. And how does that extend to work or your car? I've always heard your car is an extension of your home. So how does that work? And you're on mute, Jess.
I sure am, because I live by a firehouse station, and it goes off all the time too.
And that's the advocacy from home.
Yes.
And I forgot to say before you answer the question, for those of you who have questions, and I apologize for not saying this at the top of the presentation, there's a Q&A box. Go ahead and type them in, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can. And back to you, Jess.
Yeah, so definitely in our Know Your Rights presentations, when it comes to police encounters, when we say about like your cars, that you do have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that car. So usually what we tell folks is if you're pulled over, and unless again, like that officer like has a warrant, if they're asking you for name and license and registration, and they're saying, hey, we're getting reports of, like drug trafficking, like on this highway. Do you mind if we search your car? Well, you always have the right to refuse the search. Again, because once you consent, they no longer need a warrant to search it. And sometimes, we always say that, hey, I have a husband, he uses my car, I trust him. But that doesn't mean that I know everything that he's doing in my car. And so if, I was to allow an officer to search my car and then they find something that may suggest illegal activity, well, if I've consented, then, it's basically fair game. So certainly, if you're even ordered out of your car, please be sure to close it, because if you keep that door open, then all of a sudden it is, whatever is kind of seen from the street in your car becomes kind of like public view, and you kind of lose some of that privacy. So that's kind of the general like what we teach in our Know Your Rights trainings when it comes to privacy of your car.
Great, thank you. The next one, it could be for Jen or Jess. Could data from these contact tracing measures be sold to companies? Yeah, so the example they give is COVID survivors having their data shared with insurance companies, leading to higher premiums, individualized price gouging of certain medical products, etc., etc.
Yeah. So again, there's no federal law that bars the collection of or the selling of data. I mean, there is HIPAA, but there are limitations, right? Because we know that, I forget the actual term for them, but things like Fitbit or like wearable health gadgets, and I obviously don't use them, is that is sensitive, private, personal health information, but it doesn't get covered by HIPAA. It gets sold left and right. So unfortunately, in the US, we don't have the protections in place to prevent that from happening. Jess, maybe you could speak a little more to infected people being shared with their insurance companies, but I don't think there's a way to prevent that because we all know how our insurance.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of my similar understanding, because we don't have really strong, federal laws that protects, folks' data from getting sold. I can't say for sure that it stops a company from selling that data.
Okay, great. We have a question. What ways can I opt out of sharing my data or get paid for the data?
Get paid? I see. I'm for that. I'm with it because, but
according to you, I give a lot of data away, so I should be getting paid.
We should all be. There should be a better balance. No, that's an excellent question, and we're going to include that originally. Actually, just put it as digital contraceptives, which I love so much. And so it's hard. It's a convoluted place to give guidance because it varies so much depending on what platform or app you're using, and let alone are you using Mac or a PC or and that makes it harder to find where to change these settings. But what I can do is include some basics on how to do that in my follow-up email, if that should suffice.
Great. And this is back to the earlier question about the car being searched. So can you search a car after a minor traffic, like a traffic stop for a minor violation, like running a red light, not
so I mean, I definitely would say, one thing that I definitely want to be careful of is that we're not attorneys, here. And so to give a full answer, every situation is based on the facts of the situation. So I just want to, be mindful, we certainly could have different hypotheticals, but each situation is different. And so we won't be able to give full answer to that.
That's a good answer. And then what current legislation can we support to get stronger consumer protection? Is there?
Yeah, that is a great question. So unfortunately, because of COVID, that it has stopped some of the state legislation that we were expecting to see here in Colorado that would have been more privacy friendly. And it also has kind of pumped the brakes on federal privacy acts. And so there isn't much. I'm actually talking, but if you stay in touch with us, we will definitely let you know, because I'm talking with our colleagues at ACLU National, who work in DC and work with the politicians to actually pass these laws to make sure that they alert us of any of that legislation, ways for people to get involved. But I would also want to note here that to be aware of kind of the wolf in sheep's clothing legislation that we're seeing. So basically, big tech knows that stricter privacy regulations are inevitable because of the public's appetite and because of trends and precedents being set. We have the California law, and of course the EU's GDPR. Now, the big tech companies were keen on that, right? So they're like, okay, our new strategy, because it's inevitable, is to shop around legislation federally and at the state level that sounds privacy friendly, but is actually way weaker if you do the analysis. And a lot of the big tech-backed federal legislation that says things like no facial recognition technology and ability to opt out have a lot of exceptions, so make them, they're full of holes. It's just like a Swiss cheese policy. And what's really important about the federal, the poison pill in the federal bills that big tech is shopping around is that they have preemption clauses. So those preemption clauses take precedent over state laws that might be stricter and more privacy friendly. So right now there's actually not much to act on besides, like, we're in very much of a defense mode with COVID, but if anything comes down the pipe, you better believe you will hear from us. And if you hear of anything, again, let us know.
Okay. And Jess, this one might be a little too, specific, but do you have to submit to TSA request to search your phone at the border?
I mean, again, you always have the right to refuse consent, but we know that when it comes to borders, they work a little bit differently than other expectations of privacy because they're considered international, and airports are kind of the same way. I would really probably say direct folks to the Electronic Frontier Foundation because they have a lot of information to that very topic as to what you do when you are subjected to a search. And it really is kind of a balance as to whether you consent or, be detained. But they have a lot of information, so I definitely say check them out as a resource.
Definitely. And the last thing is not a question. It's from Wendy, who is one of our great volunteers. She just wants to say that epidemiologists seem to favor human-conducted contact tracing. So we don't want to leave the impression that humans doing contact tracing is bad. Colorado remains 14th in COVID deaths, and we are nowhere near any of the 20+ countries that have brought deaths down to zero or near zero. We need some kind of tracing.
Yes, and to Wendy's point, yeah, it's important. It seems like when we talk about this, there's like the runaway of, oh, technology will do this. It's like, no, there's actually, if there is technology, it should only be there to enhance, this is at least ACLU's stance, to enhance the work of human beings who are far more reliable and proven to do this work. And I also think, it's more speculative, there's a really good opportunity to employ folks to provide jobs because we need to scale up how many contact tracers we have. So it's another plug that we can use as advocates.
Cool. All right. Well, that is all the questions we have right now. And I want to thank Jess and Jen for the wonderful information they provided us. Again, you can always contact us, info@aclu-co.org or voting@aclu-co.org. Oh, we got one more question. No, thank you. Thank you, Wendy. And we will be taking next week off from webinars, but we will be back on the 19th and 21st with some really great webinars. So stay tuned, watch your email, come to our Advocacy at Home webpage and see what's up in the next couple of weeks. And thanks again, Jess and Jen.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.